The morning sun streamed through the massive windows of Terminal 3 at Singapore International Airport, casting long shadows across the polished floors. It was just another busy Monday, with travelers rushing to their gates, dragging their wheeled luggage behind them. Among them walked Ms. Lee, a woman in her mid-30s, dressed in comfortable black joggers and an oversized navy blue sweater, a stark contrast to her usual power suits and stilettos. After 2 weeks of non-stop meetings across Asia, she had deliberately chosen comfort over corporate appearance for her long-haul flight back to Los Angeles. Her hair was tied in a simple ponytail, and she wore minimal makeup, giving in to the exhaustion that came from closing major aviation deals across 3 countries. At Gate C-23, business-class passengers were already forming a line. Ms. Lee stood quietly at the back, scrolling through her phone, responding to last-minute emails from her team. She could feel the weight of her recent achievements, the successful negotiation of a major fleet expansion, and the upcoming announcement of her new role that would reshape the aviation industry's approach to customer service. Flight attendant Rita Wilson stood at the gate, greeting passengers with practiced efficiency. Her perfectly pressed uniform and meticulously applied makeup spoke of someone who took pride in maintaining a professional appearance. However, beneath that polished exterior lay something less admirable, deeply ingrained prejudices that she'd never been called out for. As the line moved forward, Rita's greetings varied noticeably. "Welcome aboard, sir. Have a pleasant flight." She beamed at a tall businessman in an expensive suit. "Good morning, ma'am. Right this way." She chirped at an elderly woman tripping in jewelry. But when Ms. Lee approached, Rita's smile flickered, her eyes doing a quick, dismissive scan of the casual attire and Asian features. "Boarding pass," Rita said curtly, the warmth in her voice completely evaporated. She examined Ms. Lee's business-class ticket with poorly concealed skepticism. "Are you sure you're in the right line?" she asked, her tone dripping with condescension. "Economy boarding is in 30 minutes." Several passengers nearby shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke up. Ms. Lee had encountered such behavior before, the assumption that she couldn't possibly belong in business class because of how she looked or dressed. She maintained her composure, a skill honed through years of navigating corporate boardrooms. "Yes, I'm sure," Ms. Lee replied calmly, pointing to her seat number on the boarding pass. 12A, business class. Rita's lips tightened into a thin line. She scanned the boarding pass with deliberate slowness, as if hoping to find some mistake. Finding none, she handed it back without making eye contact. "Down the jet bridge, turn left at the aircraft door," she instructed mechanically, already turning her attention to the next passenger with a bright welcome aboard. As Ms. Lee walked down the jet bridge, she couldn't help but overhear Rita's warm greeting to the passenger behind her. "Have a wonderful flight, sir. Please let us know if you need anything at all." Boarding the aircraft, Ms. Lee was greeted by another flight attendant who gave her the same quick once-over. She could see the 2 crew members exchange meaningful glances, the kind that spoke volumes without saying a word. Making her way to seat 12A, she noticed how other passengers in business class looked up at her with mild surprise, their expressions reflecting the same prejudices she had faced at the gate. Ms. Lee stored her small carry-on in the overhead compartment and settled into her seat, deliberately ignoring the whispered conversation between Reba and another flight attendant at the galley. She could feel their eyes on her, making assumptions, judging her presence in business class. A young flight attendant approached with pre-departure drinks, offering champagne and orange juice to other passengers with a bright smile. When she reached Ms. Lee's seat, she practically thrust the tray forward without a word, barely waiting for her to select a drink before moving on. As the cabin filled up, Ms. Lee observed Rita moving through the business class cabin, offering to hang up jackets and explaining the seat features to other passengers. She deliberately skipped Ms. Lee's seat each time, attending to everyone else with exaggerated courtesy. A businessman in the seat across the aisle was given a detailed explanation of the seat controls, entertainment system, and dining options. "If you need anything at all, just press the call button," Rita told him warmly. "We're here to make your flight as comfortable as possible." Ms. Lee pulled out her tablet, beginning to take notes on what she was observing. As the newly appointed head of customer experience, these moments would prove invaluable in understanding what needed to change within the airline's culture. She documented every interaction, every slight and every instance of discriminatory behavior, all while maintaining an air of quiet dignity. The irony wasn't lost on her. Here she was, about to take charge of the very department that would be responsible for training these flight attendants, witnessing firsthand the problems she would need to address. But for now, she remained just another passenger in their eyes, one they had already decided didn't belong. As the final passengers boarded, Rita made one last pass through the cabin, checking seat belts and ensuring overhead bins were properly closed. She paused at Ms. Lee's row, frowning at her carry-on bag visible through the partially open bin. "Miss," Rita said, emphasizing the word in a way that made it sound like an insult, "your bag looks a bit large. We might need to check it." Ms. Lee looked up calmly. "It's a standard carry-on size," she replied. "I flew here with it in business class last week without any issues." "Well, policies can change," Rita responded with a tight smile. "And we need to ensure compliance with all safety regulations." A man across the aisle spoke up. "My bag is larger than hers," he pointed out, "and you didn't say anything about it." Rita's face flushed slightly, but she quickly recovered. "Sir, I'm just doing my job. Safety is our primary concern." She gave Ms. Lee one last disapproving look before moving on, leaving the overhead bin untouched. The captain's voice came over the intercom, welcoming passengers aboard and announcing their flight time to Los Angeles. As the safety demonstration began, Ms. Lee noticed how Rita and the other flight attendants seemed to direct their demonstrations primarily toward the other business class passengers, as if she were invisible in her seat. She took out her phone one last time before the flight mode announcement, sending a quick email to her assistant, "Meeting with HR upon arrival. We need to discuss comprehensive changes to our training programs. I've just experienced exactly what needs to be addressed." As the aircraft began to push back from the gate, Ms. Lee settled into her seat, knowing this would be a very interesting flight. The next 14 hours would give her plenty of time to observe and document the kind of behavior that had no place in modern aviation, or anywhere else for that matter. Little did Rita know that her actions today would become a catalyst for major changes in the airline's approach to customer service and inclusive treatment of all passengers. 2 hours into the flight, the seatbelt signs finally dimmed. The business class cabin settled into its usual rhythm, with passengers either dozing off or immersing themselves in movies. Ms. Lee had just finished reviewing some documents when the drink service began. She watched as Rita methodically worked her way through the cabin, her cart laden with premium spirits and wines. "Would you care for a drink, sir?" Rita's voice was honey-sweet as she served the businessman in 12C. "We have a lovely Australian Shiraz that I highly recommend." She carefully placed a crisp white napkin on his tray table, arranging the wine glass with practiced precision. The cart moved forward, serving each passenger with the same attentive care. Until it reached Ms. Lee's seat, Rita deliberately turned away, restocking glasses on the opposite side of the cart while asking the passenger behind Ms. Lee about their drink preferences. Ms. Lee pressed her call button. A young flight attendant named Joy glanced over, made eye contact, and quickly looked away. The call button continued to glow, unanswered. 5 minutes passed. 10 minutes. Other passengers were beginning to notice. An elderly gentleman across the aisle frowned, watching as 2 more drink services passed by Ms. Lee's seat without acknowledgement. Each time, Rita found something to adjust in the cart or turned to chat with other passengers, creating an obvious barrier. Finally, Ms. Lee pressed the call button again. This time, Joy approached reluctantly, likely sent by another crew member who had noticed the prolonged ignorance of a business-class passenger's call. "Yes?" Joy's question came out clipped and cold. "I'd like to order a drink, please," Ms. Lee said politely, "since I seem to have been missed during the regular service." "Oh, were you?" Rita's voice cut in as she suddenly appeared beside Joy. "I must not have seen you a signal. What would you like?" Her tone carried a clear message: "You don't belong here, and I'm only serving you because I have to." "Green tea, please," Ms. Lee requested. Rita's lips curved into a patronizing smile. "Of course you'd want tea," she muttered, just loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. How predictable. A woman in 14D looked up sharply from her magazine, her expression showing clear disapproval of Rita's behavior. The businessman in 12C had removed his headphones, now openly watching the interaction. When Rita returned with the tea, she practically dropped it on Ms. Lee's tray table, causing hot liquid to slosh over the rim. No napkin was offered to clean up the spill. "Oops," Rita said, not even attempting to sound sincere. "You should be more careful with that. These seats are expensive, you know." Ms. Lee calmly used her own tissue to wipe up the spill. "Could I get the entertainment system to work, please?" "The screen seems to be frozen." Rita let out an exaggerated sigh. "Did you try pressing the power button? It's the big round one, should be fairly obvious." She spoke slowly, as if explaining something to a child. "Or would you like me to draw a picture to help you understand?" The businessman in 12C had pulled out his phone by this point, discreetly beginning to record. Other passengers exchanged uncomfortable glances, the tension in the cabin growing thick enough to cut with a knife. "I've tried the power button," Ms. Lee replied evenly. "The system appears to need a reset." "Well, I'm sure someone with your background might find our technology a bit challenging," Rita said with false sympathy. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable with a magazine instead. We have some simple ones in the seat pocket." A soft gasp came from somewhere behind them. Joy, the younger flight attendant, had turned bright red and was suddenly very interested in reorganizing the drink cart. Ms. Lee reached for her handbag, pulling out a small notebook. "Could I have your employee number, please? And the name of your supervisor?" Rita straightened up, her smile turning sharp. "Of course. I'm Rita Wilson, employee number 247,813. My direct supervisor is Mr. Chen in cabin services. Feel free to file any complaint you'd like." She emphasized the name Chen with a slight smirk, clearly assuming this shared surname would somehow work in her favor. "Thank you, Ms. Wilson. I'll make sure to note everything down accurately." Ms. Lee began writing, her handwriting neat and deliberate. Rita leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper that nevertheless carried to nearby seats. "You know, some people should learn to be grateful when they're allowed in spaces they don't usually have access to. Complaining just makes you look ungrateful." The businessman who had been recording cleared his throat loudly. "Excuse me, but I couldn't help overhearing. I'd be happy to provide a witness statement about what I've observed during this flight." "That won't be necessary, sir," Rita said quickly, her demeanor instantly transforming back into professional pleasantness. "Just a small misunderstanding about our entertainment system." "It didn't sound like a misunderstanding to me," a woman's voice called from 2 rows back. "I've been listening to you make snide comments for the past hour." Rita's face flushed. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed her features. She looked around the cabin, suddenly aware of the many disapproving faces turned in her direction. Joy approached tentatively. "Rita, maybe I should help with the entertainment system." Her voice trailed off as Rita shot her a sharp look. "I can handle this," Rita snapped. She turned back to Ms. Lee. "Let me spell it out for you. Press the power button. Wait 10 seconds. Press it again. Even you should be able to manage that." Ms. Lee continued writing in her notebook, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to Rita's increasingly flustered state. "Could you repeat that last comment, please? I want to make sure I quote you accurately." More phones had appeared throughout the cabin, their cameras discreetly capturing the interaction. Rita noticed this too, her confidence visibly wavering. "I have better things to do than waste time here," Rita declared, turning on her heel. As she stormed off toward the galley, she could be heard muttering, "Some people just don't know their place." The cabin remained silent for a moment after her departure. Then, one by one, passengers began offering their contact information to Ms. Lee, volunteering to corroborate her account of events. The businessman who had recorded the interaction even offered to email her the video. Ms. Lee thanked them all graciously but didn't reveal her position. She simply continued documenting every detail, occasionally glancing toward the galley where Rita could be seen gesturing animatedly to other crew members, clearly trying to justify her behavior. The entertainment system remained frozen, a silent testament to the unresolved situation. But Ms. Lee didn't mind. She had witnessed exactly the kind of behavior she had been brought in to address, and Rita had provided her with more than enough material to work with. As the flight continued, Rita's subsequent passes through the cabin were marked by stony silence, her previous smugness replaced by visible nervousness. She had finally realized that perhaps, just perhaps, she had seriously misjudged the situation, But exactly how badly she had miscalculated would only become clear after landing. The flight had reached its cruising altitude over the Pacific Ocean when things began to shift in the business class cabin. What had started as uncomfortable tension was now transforming into open concern among the passengers. The businessman in 12C, Mr. Park, had quietly shown his recorded video to a few nearby passengers, their expressions darkening as they watched. A silver-haired woman in row 14 pulled out her phone and started typing rapidly. "My daughter works for a major news network," she whispered to her seatmate. "This kind of behavior shouldn't go unreported." Her fingers moved swiftly across the screen, likely composing an email that would eventually reach more eyes than Rita could imagine. Meanwhile, Joy, the younger flight attendant, was visibly struggling with her conscience. During the meal service, she kept glancing nervously between Reba and Ms. Lee, her hands shaking slightly as she laid out tablecloths. When she reached Ms. Lee's seat, she quietly whispered, "I'm so sorry about all this," before quickly moving on. Reva noticed this interaction and called Joy back to the galley. Their heated whispers carried faintly through the cabin. "Don't apologize to her. You're undermining my authority." The rest was lost in the hum of the engines, but Joy's face told the whole story as she emerged, blinking back tears. Mr. Park stood up, presumably heading to the restroom, but paused by Ms. Lee's seat. "I've been flying this route monthly for 3 years," he said, loud enough for others to hear. "I've never seen such unprofessional behavior from any crew member. You're handling this with remarkable grace." Rita appeared almost instantly. "Sir, please return to your seat. We're expecting turbulence." The seat belt sign remained unlit, betraying her excuse. "Funny," Mr. Park replied. "The sky looks perfectly clear to me." He pulled out his business card and handed it to Ms. Lee. "I'm a corporate lawyer. Please don't hesitate to contact me if you need a witness statement." The older woman from row 14 chose this moment to make her own trip to the restroom, stopping briefly at Ms. Lee's seat. "I've got the whole thing on video, dear. My daughter's already looking into the airline's history of similar incidents." Rita's face paled slightly. She retreated to the galley, where she could be seen making a phone call, her back turned to the cabin as she spoke in hushed tones. A young couple seated in the mini-cabin behind Ms. Lee leaned forward. "We're social media consultants," the woman said. "We've seen things like this go viral before. The airline needs to know about this behavior." Ms. Lee thanked each passenger calmly, continuing to write in her notebook. She hadn't raised her voice once, hadn't shown any sign of the anger she surely must have felt. Her composure seemed to infuriate Reba even more. During the next drink service, Rita's hands were shaking. She'd clearly realized that this situation was spiraling beyond her control. As she pushed the cart past Ms. Lee's seat, again without offering service, she knocked over a glass of water on another passenger's tray. "Oh, look who's being clumsy now," came a dry comment from somewhere in the cabin. Several passengers chuckled, and Rita's face turned scarlet. The flight's chief purser, a veteran crew member named Mr. Singh, finally emerged from first class, having been summoned by concerned crew members. He took one look at the tense atmosphere in the cabin and pulled Rita aside for a quiet but intense conversation. Ms. Lee used this moment to press her call button again. Joy responded immediately this time, casting nervous glances toward the galley where Rita and Mr. Singh were still talking. "Could I speak with Mr. Singh when he's available?" Ms. Lee asked politely. "I have some concerns about the service on this flight that need to be addressed." Joy nodded quickly. "Of course, I'll let him know right away." She paused, then added in a rush, "I want you to know that not all of us, that is, what happened today." She struggled to find the right words. "I understand," Ms. Lee assured her. "Sometimes staying silent in the face of wrong behavior feels easier than speaking up." "But that doesn't make it right, does it?" Joy's eyes welled up. "No, it doesn't. I should have said something sooner. I'm going to file my own report about this when we land." In the galley, Rita's voice suddenly rose. "They're all exaggerating. That woman's been difficult since boarding. She's just trying to get free upgrades or compensation." Mr. Singh's response was too quiet to hear, but Rita's face suggested it wasn't what she wanted to hear. She stormed off toward the rear galley, nearly colliding with a passenger returning from the bathroom. The next hour passed in tense silence. Rita had been relegated to working in economy class, while Mr. Singh personally oversaw the business class service. He approached Ms. Lee's seat with professional courtesy. "Madam, I understand there have been some issues during the flight. I want to assure you that we take these matters very seriously." He offered her a comment card, but Ms. Lee was already holding up a thick stack of papers, witness statements collected from surrounding passengers. "Thank you, Mr. Singh. I've already documented everything in detail, including times, specific comments, and witness accounts. I'll be following up through the appropriate channels after we land." Mr. Singh's eyes widened slightly at the thoroughness of her documentation. "Of course, madam. Please let me know if there's anything else you need during the remainder of the flight." As he walked away, more passengers began sharing their own experiences. A businessman from row 15 mentioned seeing similar behavior from Rita on a previous flight. A flight attendant from another airline, traveling as a passenger, spoke quietly about how such conduct violated every standard of professional service. The atmosphere in the cabin had completely transformed. What started as one woman's isolated experience had become a shared moment of solidarity. Passengers who had been hesitant to speak up initially were now openly discussing what they'd witnessed. Rita made one final appearance in business class, presumably on her way to the crew rest area. She kept her eyes down, but not before noticing that several passengers were still recording on their phones. Her earlier smugness had evaporated entirely, replaced by visible anxiety. Ms. Lee closed her notebook and leaned back in her seat, closing her eyes briefly. She hadn't intended to conduct a field study of discriminatory behavior on this flight, but the evidence she'd gathered would prove invaluable in the changes she planned to implement. A gentle tap on her shoulder caught her attention. An elderly passenger handed her a note. "My grandson works in HR at corporate headquarters. I'm sending him everything I recorded today. This needs to stop." Little did anyone know that Ms. Lee wouldn't need to send her complaint up the corporate ladder. She was the corporate ladder. But for now, she simply smiled and thanked the concerned passenger, knowing that in just a few hours, Rita would discover exactly who she had chosen to disrespect. 3 hours before landing in Los Angeles, a new shift of flight attendants emerged from their rest period. Among them was Mrs. Stone, a senior crew member with 20 years of experience. She paused in the business class cabin, her eyes scanning the passengers as she prepared to take over service duties. Suddenly, her face lit up with recognition. She looked at Ms. Lee, then quickly checked her tablet and looked again. Her eyes widened. Without saying a word, she hurried to the galley where Mr. Singh was preparing for the next meal service. "Do you know who's sitting in 12A? Mrs. Stone whispered urgently, but not quietly enough to prevent nearby passengers from overhearing. "That's our new Chief Operations Officer, the one headquarters announced last week." Mr. Singh nearly dropped the cup he was holding. "What? Are you sure?" "Absolutely certain. I was at the leadership conference in Singapore last month where she was introduced. She's been brought in to oversee the entire customer experience transformation project. The memo said she'd be conducting unannounced flight audits, but I never thought." Their conversation was interrupted by Rita, who had returned from economy class looking tired and irritated. "What are you two whispering about?" Mrs. Zhang turned to face her colleague, her expression a mixture of concern and disbelief. "Rita, that passenger you've been—" She paused, searching for the right words. "Having issues with? That's Ms. Lee, our new Chief Operations Officer." The color drained from Rita's face. "You're joking," she said weakly, grabbing the tablet from Mrs. Stone's hands. There on the screen was a company announcement featuring a photo of Ms. Lee at a recent board meeting. The same woman who was now sitting in 12A, whom Rita had spent the last 9 hours treating with undisguised contempt. "Oh God," Rita whispered, her hands beginning to shake. "Oh God, oh God, oh God." The news spread through the crew like wildfire. Joy, who had been restocking supplies, overheard everything. She couldn't help but give a small, vindicated smile. She'd known something was terribly wrong with how Rita had been behaving, and now the consequences were about to unfold. Back in the cabin, passengers who had been watching the drama develop throughout the flight began picking up on the change in the crew's behavior. The whispers, the nervous glances, the way every crew member who passed through suddenly became extra attentive to Ms. Lee, it all pointed to something significant having changed. "Mr. Park," The businessman who had recorded the earlier incidents leaned across the aisle. "I think they'd finally figured it out," he said to Ms. Lee with a knowing smile. "I looked you up on LinkedIn while you were napping earlier. Quite an impressive career you've had." Ms. Lee gave him a quiet smile but said nothing. She had spent her entire career working to change corporate cultures from within, and this flight had given her a perfect case study of exactly what needed to change. In the galley, Rita was having a minor meltdown. "What am I going to do? She has all those witness statements. Everyone was recording. I'll lose my job." 23 years of service, gone just like that. Mrs. Zhang put a comforting hand on her shoulder, though her expression remained stern. "Maybe you should have thought about that before making assumptions about passengers based on their appearance." "I didn't know," Rita protested weakly. "That's exactly the point," Mr. Singh cut in. "You shouldn't treat anyone that way, regardless of who they are. Every passenger deserves respect." The remainder of the crew watched this exchange with varying expressions of sympathy and disapproval. Some had worked with Rita for years and knew this wasn't an isolated incident. Others were new enough to be shocked by her behavior. A young crew member named David spoke up from the corner. "My grandmother came to this country 30 years ago. She still tells stories about how people treated her on planes, in stores everywhere." "I never thought I'd see that same behavior from one of our own crew members." Rita sank into a jump seat, her face in her hands. Through her fingers, she mumbled, "Should I go apologize?" "Not now," Mrs. Zhang said firmly. "You're clearly not in the right state of mind, and anything you say could make things worse. Finish your duties in economy class. We'll handle business class service for the remainder of the flight." In the cabin, Ms. Lee continued working on her laptop, appearing completely oblivious to the drama unfolding around her. She had opened a document titled Customer Experience Transformation Initiative and was typing rapidly, occasionally pausing to reference her notes from the flight. The elderly passenger who had spoken up earlier stopped by her seat on the way to the lavatory. "I just overheard the crew talking," she said with a satisfied smile. "Karma works in wonderful ways, doesn't it?" Ms. Lee looked up from her laptop. "It's not about karma," she replied thoughtfully. "It's about creating systemic change. Sometimes we need to experience problems firsthand to truly understand how to fix them." Meanwhile, photos and videos from the flight had already begun circulating on social media. Passengers with in-flight Wi-Fi had shared their recordings, and the airline's public relations team was about to have a very busy day. Rita made one final pass through business class, pushing a cart of duty-free items. She kept her eyes down, her earlier arrogance replaced by visible dread. Every passenger she had treated dismissively now knew exactly who she had been disrespecting, and the irony was lost on no one. As the flight began its initial descent into Los Angeles, Ms. Lee closed her laptop and looked out the window. The incident had given her valuable insights into what needed to change within the airline's culture. But more importantly, it had shown her which employees might become allies in implementing those changes, and which ones would resist them. Joy approached with landing cards, her manner professional but warm. "Ms. Lee," she said quietly, "I want you to know that many of us are looking forward to the changes you'll bring to our airline. What happened today, it's not who we want to be." Ms. Lee nodded appreciatively. "Change starts with people willing to acknowledge when something is wrong. Thank you for finding your voice today." In the back alley, Rita sat alone, staring at nothing in particular. In a few hours, she would face the consequences of her actions. But what she didn't know yet was that those consequences would lead to something much larger than just her own future at the airline. The Los Angeles International Airport buzzed with its usual morning activity as Flight 287 touched down. While other passengers rushed to collect their belongings, Ms. Lee remained seated, calmly gathering her documentation. The videos, witness statements, and her own detailed notes would soon become the foundation for major changes within the airline. Rita stood in the galley, her uniform perfectly pressed, but her confidence completely shattered. Through the cabin window, she could see 3 airline officials waiting at the gate. Their presence at this early hour certainly wasn't routine. Mrs. Zhang placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "They'll want to speak with you immediately. Remember, honesty is your best option now." As passengers began deplaning, many paused to share final words with Ms. Lee. "Mr. Park, The businessman who had recorded the incidents handed her his card. "The video is already uploaded to my cloud drive. I'll send you the link." He lowered his voice. "My law firm handles corporate discrimination cases, but I hope your position means this can be addressed internally." The elderly woman from row 14 stopped by as well. "My daughter's news network has already reached out to the airline's PR team. They're calling it a developing situation." She smiled warmly at Ms. Lee. "Give them hell, dear." Joy, the young flight attendant who had found her courage during the flight, was collecting trash with trembling hands. "Will they fire all of us?" she whispered to Mrs. Shan. "I should have spoken up sooner." Ms. Lee overheard this and paused in the aisle. "Speaking up late is better than not speaking up at all," she said kindly. "Change doesn't happen overnight, but it has to start somewhere." The aircraft slowly emptied until only the crew and Ms. Lee remained. Rita stood near the exit, her face pale but composed. As Ms. Lee approached the door, Rita finally spoke. I'm sorry. I know it doesn't make up for anything, but I'm sorry." Ms. Lee paused. "You're right. It doesn't make up for anything. But what matters now is what we learn from this." She turned to the entire crew. "I'll see you all in the meeting room in 1 hour." In the terminal, the airline officials stepped forward. "Ms. Lee, welcome to Los Angeles. We've arranged a car to take you directly to headquarters." One of them reached for her carry-on, but she kept hold of it herself. "Actually," she said, "I need to make a stop at my hotel first. I want to review all the documentation before the meeting, and I believe our HR director should be present as well." The officials exchanged glances. One pulled out his phone and stepped away to make calls. Word was spreading quickly through the airline's corporate channels. By now, several videos from the flight had gained traction on social media. The airline's PR team was in crisis mode, trying to craft a response. At the hotel, Ms. Lee changed into a crisp business suit, a dramatic transformation from her casual flight attire. She laid out all the evidence on the hotel room's desk: handwritten witness statements, video files shared by passengers, her own detailed notes. Each documented instance of discrimination was a thread in a larger tapestry of systemic issues she'd been brought in to address. Her phone buzzed continuously with messages from airline executives, PR teams, and even board members. Everyone wanted to know how she planned to handle the situation. Instead of responding immediately, she took a moment to gather her thoughts. The hotel room phone rang. The airline's HR director was in the lobby. "Come up," Ms. Lee told her. "We need to discuss this privately first." Mrs. Patel, the HR director, arrived looking concerned. "I've reviewed the preliminary reports," she said, settling into a chair. "Rita has been with us for over 2 decades. Her record shows previous incidents, but nothing this severe." "Nothing this documented, you mean," Ms. Lee corrected. "Look at these passenger statements. Many mention seeing similar behavior on other flights." This isn't an isolated incident, it's just the first time someone with authority was on the receiving end. Together, they reviewed the evidence. Mrs. Patel's expression grew more troubled with each video, each witness statement. "The board will want immediate termination," she said finally. "It's the easiest solution." "Easy isn't always right," Ms. Lee replied. "Firing one flight attendant won't fix the underlying problems. We need systemic change." She pulled out her laptop, opening a draft proposal she'd worked on during the flight. "Here's what I'm thinking." Meanwhile, at the airline's headquarters, Rita sat in a small conference room, still in her flight uniform. Union representatives had arrived to support her, but even they looked grim after viewing the videos. The airline's legal team worked in a room nearby, assessing potential damages. Joy and the other crew members waited in a separate area, each writing their own accounts of what had transpired. Mrs. Shan had taken charge, ensuring everyone documented their observations accurately. "Remember," she told them, "this is about making things right, not just protecting ourselves." Security footage from the airport showed Mr. Park sharing his videos with reporters who had somehow gotten wind of the story. The airline's social media team reported a growing storm of comments and shares. This was quickly becoming more than just an HR issue. Back at the hotel, Ms. Lee finished outlining her approach to Mrs. Patel. "Instead of just punitive measures, we're going to use this as a catalyst for real change." I want a complete overhaul of our training programs, regular cultural sensitivity assessments, and a new system for reporting and addressing discriminatory behavior." Mrs. Patel looked skeptical. "The board will want quick action. This is already becoming a PR nightmare." "Then let's show them how to turn a nightmare into an opportunity," Ms. Lee replied, standing up. "It's time for the meeting. Is everyone assembled?" "Yes," Mrs. Patel confirmed. "Rita and her union representatives, the crew members, our legal team, PR department, and senior management. They're all waiting." Ms. Lee gathered her documents. The next few hours would determine not just Rita's fate, but the future culture of the entire airline. As she headed for the door, she paused. "You know, Mrs. Patel, sometimes the most powerful lessons come from our most uncomfortable moments." The hotel room door clicked shut behind them. In the coming hours, decisions would be made that would reshape airline policies across the industry. But first, there would be some very difficult conversations. The airline's main conference room was packed to capacity. Executives in expensive suits sat around the massive oak table, while others lined the walls. Rita sat at one end, flanked by union representatives. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, knuckles white with tension. The room fell silent as Ms. Lee entered, followed by Mrs. Patel from HR. Gone was any trace of the casual traveler from the flight. In her sharp business suit and carrying a thick folder of documents, she radiated quiet authority. Several executives who had been scrolling through their phones quickly put them away. "Good morning," Ms. Lee began, her voice calm but firm. "I'm sure you've all seen the videos circulating on social media. But there's more to this situation than what's gone viral." She opened her folder, spreading out passenger statements and printed screenshots across the table. The airline's PR director spoke up first. "Ms. Lee, we've prepared a statement announcing immediate termination and—" "No," Ms. Lee cut in. "We're not taking the easy way out. This isn't about one person or one incident. This is about systemic issues that need addressing." She turned to Rita, who seemed to shrink in her chair. "Would you like to explain your actions during the flight?" Rita's voice trembled. I made assumptions. I judged based on appearance. I've been doing this job for so long, I thought I knew." She trailed off, tears welling in her eyes. "You thought you knew what?" Ms. Lee pressed. "What someone who belongs in business class looks like? What a senior executive should look like?" The room was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning hum. Several executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats, perhaps recognizing their own hidden biases. Mrs. Zhang, who had been asked to attend, spoke up from her position near the wall. "This isn't the first time we've had incidents like this. It's just the first time it happened to someone who could do something about it." The PR director looked alarmed. "Are you suggesting this is a pattern?" "Let me show you something," Ms. Lee said, pulling up emails on the conference room screen. "These are passenger complaints from the past year alone. Notice any patterns?" She scrolled through dozens of messages describing discriminatory treatment, most of which had been dismissed with form responses. The legal team exchanged worried glances. One of them cleared his throat. "Given the potential liability—" "This isn't about liability," Ms. Lee interrupted. "This is about who we want to be as an airline." She turned back to Rita. "You've been here 23 years. In all that time, did anyone ever seriously address these behaviors with you?" Rita shook her head slowly. "There were complaints, but nothing ever came of them. I guess I thought that meant it was okay." "And that's exactly the problem," Ms. Lee said, addressing the entire room. "We've created a culture where this behavior is tacitly accepted. Well, that ends today." She pulled out a document and handed copies to everyone present. "This is my proposal for comprehensive changes. First, we're implementing mandatory anti-bias training, not just a one-time session, but ongoing education with regular assessments." The union representatives leaned forward, reading intently. One nodded approvingly. "Second, we're creating a new passenger advocacy office. Every complaint will be thoroughly investigated, not just logged and forgotten. And third, we're establishing a mentorship program pairing senior crew members with new hires from diverse backgrounds." She paused, looking directly at Rita. "As for your immediate future with this airline—" The room tensed. Rita closed her eyes, bracing for the worst. "You have a choice," Ms. Lee continued. "Option 1, Standard termination procedure. Option 2. You join our new training team as an example of how biases can blind us and how we can do better. You'll work directly with our diversity consultants to share your story and help others learn from it. Murmurs filled the room. This wasn't the punishment many had expected. The PR director looked confused. Ms. Lee, the public will demand more severe consequences. The public will respect genuine efforts at reform more than knee-jerk punishment, Ms. Lee replied. We're not just solving a PR problem, we're changing our corporate culture. Joy, who had been quietly observing from a corner, raised her hand. I'd like to volunteer for the mentorship program, she said. What happened on that flight showed me how important it is to speak up. Mrs. Patel nodded approvingly. We can build something positive from this situation, show other airlines how to handle these issues properly. Rita wiped her eyes with a tissue. I don't deserve a second chance, she said quietly. This isn't about what you deserve, Ms. Lee responded. It's about what will create lasting change. Sometimes the best teachers are those who've learned the hardest lessons. The next hour was spent discussing implementation details. The legal team revised contracts, HR began drafting new policies, and the PR department worked on a statement that would focus on positive change rather than punishment. As the meeting wound down, Ms. Lee addressed the room one final time. What happened on that flight was unacceptable, but how we respond to it will define us. We can either make this a story about punishment, or we can make it a story about transformation. Rita stood up shakily. I want to take option 2, she said. I want to help make sure no one else makes the mistakes I made. The executives began filing out, their phones already buzzing with messages about implementing the new policies. Mrs. Patel stayed behind to discuss training logistics with Rita, while Joy and Mrs. Zhang began planning the mentorship program. Ms. Lee gathered her documents, pausing to look at the now empty conference room. Sometimes the worst moments could lead to the best changes if you were willing to learn from them. Outside, phones across the country were lighting up with a new viral video, the airline's announcement of its comprehensive anti-bias initiative, featuring a tearful but determined Rita sharing her story of learning and change. It wasn't the punishment many had called for, but it was something far more valuable, a real chance at systemic change. 6 months had passed since that fateful flight. The airline's main training center buzzed with activity as a new group of flight attendants gathered for their certification course. At the front of the room stood Rita, no longer in her flight uniform, but wearing a professional blazer with a training coordinator badge. Welcome to day 1 of your journey, she began, her voice carrying the weight of experience. Today, I'm going to share a story with you, my story. It's not an easy one to tell, but it's one that changed not just my life, but our entire airline. The screen behind her showed news headlines from 6 months ago. Airline launches revolutionary anti-bias program, and from controversy to change. How one incident transformed an industry. In the back of the room sat Ms. Lee, quietly observing. She watched as Rita played the now famous videos from the flight, no longer trying to hide from her actions, but using them as powerful teaching moments. I have been flying for 23 years. Rita continued, her voice steady. I thought I knew everything about this job. But in one flight, I learned that my biggest enemy wasn't a difficult passenger or turbulent weather, it was my own prejudice. A young trainee raised her hand. Weren't you afraid of losing your job? I was terrified, Rita admitted. But Ms. Lee and the airline offered me something more valuable than job security. They offered me a chance to be part of the solution. In another part of the terminal, Joy led a mentorship meeting with 5 junior flight attendants. Now wearing a senior crew coordinator pin, she spoke confidently about handling difficult situations and the importance of speaking up against discrimination. Remember, she told her group, silence in the face of wrong isn't neutrality, it's compliance. We learned that the hard way. The airline's booking system had been updated too. Mrs. Patel from HR pointed out the new features to a group of industry representatives. Our system no longer shows passenger photos or names during seat assignment. Service should be based on the class of ticket, not assumptions about who looks like they belong there. The changes weren't just internal. At the customer service desk, a large screen displayed the airline's new passenger feedback portal. Comments scrolled past. First time flying where I didn't feel judged by my appearance. Incredible improvement in service quality. Finally, an airline that takes diversity seriously. Mr. Park, the businessman who had recorded the original incident, found himself on another flight with the airline. This time, he noticed something different. The crew moved through the cabin with a new awareness, treating each passenger with the same level of respect regardless of their appearance or attire. Back in the training room, Rita shared recent statistics. In the past 6 months, discriminatory complaints have dropped by 87%. But more importantly, crew satisfaction scores have improved by 45%. When we let go of our biases, everyone benefits. Ms. Lee finally stood up to address the trainees. What you're learning here isn't just about airline service, it's about human dignity. Rita's story reminds us that change is possible, but it takes courage to admit our mistakes and even more courage to learn from them. The airline's success had sparked industry-wide changes. Other carriers began sending representatives to observe their training program. The airline's stock price had risen as investors recognized the value of positive corporate culture. Mrs. Zhang, now heading the mentorship program, organized monthly discussion groups where crew members could openly discuss challenges and solutions. We're not just changing behaviors, she often said, we're changing hearts and minds. In the crew lounge, a wall displayed photographs from recent graduation ceremonies, diverse groups of smiling faces representing the airline's new generation of service professionals. Below them hung a simple plaque, "Every passenger's story matters." Joy's social media post about her journey from a quiet bystander to a confident advocate had gone viral. 6 months ago, I was afraid to speak up. Today, I teach others how to use their voice. The airline's training video featuring Rita's story had been viewed millions of times. Comments poured in from around the world. This is how you handle corporate mistakes. Real change happens when you focus on education, not just punishment. During a board meeting, Ms. Lee presented the 6-month impact report. Customer satisfaction scores had reached record highs. Employee retention had improved significantly. The airline's reputation for inclusive service had become a major competitive advantage. But the numbers only tell part of the story, she concluded. The real success is in the daily interactions that never make headlines, the moments when our crew members choose understanding over assumption, respect over bias. Rita's last training session of the day ended with a question that had become her favorite. What's the most important luggage we carry? The trainees responded in unison, having learned the lesson well. Our assumptions. And they're the first thing we need to check. As the sun set over the airport, Rita and Ms. Lee walked through the terminal together. They passed the gate where their story had begun 6 months ago. A new crew was boarding passengers, and they paused to watch. Look at that, Rita said softly, seeing a flight attendant help an elderly woman in a traditional dress with her carry-on, treating her with the same respect as the business executive behind her. That's what change looks like. Ms. Lee nodded. Sometimes the worst moments in our lives become the best opportunities to grow. You've helped create a legacy here that will impact generations of travelers. In the distance, a plane took off into the evening sky, carrying with it a crew trained not just in safety and service, but in the most important skill of all, seeing the humanity in every passenger, regardless of how they looked or what they wore. The story of one bad flight had transformed into a movement for change, proving that sometimes the most powerful lessons come from our biggest mistakes. As Rita liked to tell her trainees, it's not about where you start, it's about how far you're willing to go to make things right.